Hi, I'm Wayne Reeves. For over 35 years, I've been researching Toronto history in all its many guises. And what I want to do through these sessions with Backlane Studios is help you become a better Toronto urban researcher by introducing you to some of the great research tools that are available to you. Today, in this session, we're going to learn about the city directories, what they are, how to use them, what some of the pitfalls are, and hopefully you'll gain a greater understanding and appreciation of how rich the visual information is in many of these directories. So what is a directory? Well, generally it's a alphabetical organization of information, typically people, institutions, businesses. They can be quite specific as we see on the screen. But we're going to focus just on the Toronto City Directory because this is one of the most powerful research tools available to us. It provides a very general overview of what was going on in Toronto for over 170 years. And that is going to be our focus for this session. Now, city directories are not government made. They were made by private publishers. And their aim was really to connect businesses to businesses and businesses to customers by providing up-to-date name and address information. And they were really a part of a web of marketing products that included maps and other tools to allow businesses to promote themselves to the community. Now, these private publishers were quite varied into the 1870s. And then John M. Might took over. And even though he sold out for a few years in the 1880s, he came back and was the lead publisher until the late 1970s. And this is why when you work with the Toronto City Directories, they're often referred to as the Mites directories. And even when Polk, the American publisher, returned to Toronto in 1980, uh, they continued to use the term mites to refer to their Toronto products. And then finally, Polk sold out to Equifax, which closed down production of Toronto directories in 2001. The directories were made through canvassers. So these were sometimes face-to-face contacts with homeowners or homemakers out in the community to identify family members and tenants living at residential addresses. And at the same time, canvassers met directly with businesses to gain a sense of who was running the firm, what they were producing or selling, as well as gaining a list of their employees. You can find Toronto City directories most easily online through this link at the Toronto Public Library. And the great thing about tonight's session is we're going to be creating a PDF and having that available on the uh, Backlane Studios webpage so that you can follow these links much more easily. Now, you can also find physical copies and some unscanned materials at the Toronto Reference Library on Yonge Street. You can also find directories on microfilm, and these are different copies than what the Toronto Public Library has digitized. And these are available at the City of Toronto Archives on Spadina Road and at the Archives of Ontario up at York University. Canadiana Online also has a few scattered volumes up to the year 1900. So if you want to just dip in and try a basic online search, um, follow the link to the Toronto Public Library's PDFs that are also available on the digital archive. And you can see here, once you've clicked on and the PDF is loaded, simply hit Control F on your keyboard to create a search box and enter your search term. Now, some of the TPL's links take you to the Internet Archive, which you may know is a really powerful source of information, not just about Toronto, but collects documents worldwide in scope. When you encounter the directories on the Internet Archive, there is a custom search box that allows you to search inside the directory that you've pulled up. And the key thing to remember here, if you're searching with more than one word or a combination of words and numbers, always put that information into quotation marks. Now, you can also browse manually and quite quickly through the directory using thumbnail views or the scroll bars. The scroll bars are both located at the bottom of the Internet Archive pages and on the right-hand side of the pages. Okay, we're going to move beyond the basics and get into a more detailed understanding of the Toronto City directories. Year information is really important. In Toronto, directories were published from 1833-34 up till 2001, but they're not available or weren't produced for every year. In fact, up until 1860, only 7 issues were produced. But then from 1861 to the late 1970s, except for 2 years, the directories were published annually. From 1980 until 2001, usually they were published every other year and often in multiple volumes. Now, dating the directories, we should also look at it in terms of month and day info. And this is important because you want to know when was the data collected relative to the year of publication. So on the left-hand side, I've created a little database here, the in years versus the buy-in before years. And what do I mean by this? The in years mean that all or most of the data was likely collected in the year of publication. And you can express this when you're reporting on your findings that, well, um, X lived in, it was recorded in the 1833-34 directory, and we can express that as X lived at Y address in 1833. Now, of course, you can also express it as in the 1833-34 directory, X lived at Y address. But over on the right-hand side of the screen, the buy-in before years, these are the cases where we know that the data was collected in the year prior to publication, with perhaps a few weeks of cleanup in the year of publication. So here you could say that X was found in the 1837 directory, and you can express it as X lived at Y address by the end of 1836 or before 1837. And again, this is really important to provide as much clarity about when your target of research was in Toronto. Was it in the year of publication or more likely in the year before publication? And how do I know month and day information? Most of this information comes from the directory itself. Information supplied in the introduction, sometimes on the title page, and even for some of the directories that have survived intact and not been rebound on the spine of the directories themselves. Often you'll find information about when the directory was being put together or had recently been published through the Toronto newspapers. And I've provided examples here. Okay, what exactly is in the directories? Well, it varies by year. Always there's some form of introduction, an alphabetical or alpha list of inhabitants and businesses, and you'll usually find a lot of advertisements. Um, Almost always there's a street section, a classified business section, a list of abbreviations, and then each section has its own table of contents. Often you'll find miscellaneous information, information about last minute changes. Sometimes the advertisers are indexed. And on rare occasions, you'll find a postal guide provided and a numerical phone list. And it's important to point out the order of these key sections alpha streets, classified businesses, they vary year by year. And so you'll just have to get used to finding your information in different places within the file. It's really key that you try to use multiple sections rather than just rely on the street section or the alpha section. And I have an example here where you'll find a lot of information about John Brown and Company in different parts of the directory. In fact, you'll find different information about John Brown, the business leader, as you wandered through the directories, where he lived, where his business was located, who the principals were, what the lines of business were for his company. And multiple sections, as I say, give a much fuller picture. Um, who exactly was the photography company, J. Bruce and Company? Well, we find out who Jay was, Josiah, where he lived, where he operated, but also just embedded in the advertisements, a lot of information about who Bruce used to work for and what his studio now consisted of. Let's begin with the alpha section. So here we find persons, businesses, and institutions all listed in alphabetical order. Um, Place of employment is given from 1883 to 1994, and you'll also find the person's occupation from 1833 all the way up to 1994 as well. The alpha section has a guide at the start of the section. This is often useful to take a look at in terms of what new and interesting features might be added, and some tips for searching that section of the directory. Tenure is really important. We find information about who the householder was, who was residing there, either as a boarder, a roomer, or someone just living at home with their parents. In this example here, Samuel Abate at 425 and a half Young Street, we find that shares householder responsibilities with his wife Kathleen, and it appears that their daughter Pauline is also living at home. But you also find in the alpha section the interesting fact that he lived above his store at 425 and a half Young Street. Okay, so he was a grocer, a fruiterer, um, but this is who occupied the premises at 425 and a half Young. You'll often be prompted to look for alternate name spellings, and so there may be an error when the canvasser went out and misrecorded the individuals that they came across. So be aware that information may be found under a different name in the directory. Here I'm simply providing a little sample research that I did. And the key thing to keep in mind here was I started with a year where I thought that the Malvern menswear might be in business. And I worked back in 5-year increments until I did not find data related to that business or that name. And then I searched forward annually until I did find data, and that really gave me the first year that Malvern's Menwear appeared in the city directory. I meshed that up with searching online the Toronto newspapers through the Toronto Public Library's website, because I wanted to drill down to see if Sam Iacono had arrived at 1021 Kingston Road in 1950, or as it turned out, the year previously in 1949. And again, the latter date confirmed through newspaper research. Street sections. So the streets here are in alphabetical order. The location of the street is described. This is really important in Toronto, which reused street names across the city. And as other municipalities were annexed to the city of Toronto, their street names came into the directory. And so you would have multiple Queen Streets or Albert Streets. And so it's really important that you're aware that you're working with the correct street that you're interested in. Addresses then run in numerical order, and some information is provided about the occupant or occupants of each address. And it's important to point out that usually when you're searching an address, and let's say you're trying to find the earliest mention of your house in the city directory, and let's say it's 1874, like, oh, so maybe that means that it was built in 1873. You should be aware that, especially in outlying parts of the city, many residences were built without a street address being affixed at the first year of construction and then occupation. So an unnumbered building could have existed on that block earlier. And the way you can confirm this is by looking through the assessment rolls at the City of Toronto Archives, which are the most authoritative research tool compared to the directors themselves. So each street section often usually comes with some guidance on how to use the section. The Street Finder was a really useful tool for working through multi-volume directories. Symbols also appear in the directories. You'll want to be aware of these. Starting in 1976, streets were not listed by odd or even number, but in straight numerical order. But a few streets were not dealt with in this way. And again, this is indicated at the beginning of the street section, beginning in the 1970s. Home ownership started to be identified in the city directory starting in 1931. And so we can see over here on the on the right-hand side, Mrs. Teresa Abate at 182 Beatrice Street. So the asterisk means that she is not just the householder, that the head of the residence, but also the property owner. And you can see over when you combine this information with what's found in the alpha section that her sons Frank and Robert are living with her, and she in fact is a widow, which often provides some information about the widow's late husband, as it does here. So I mentioned earlier, the order of listings changes before 1975. Streets are listed on with odd and even sides, usually east before west, north before south. But starting in 1975, we go to a straight numerical order for most streets. And here's an example from Scarborough. Okay, streets. Streets could change their names. And I mentioned earlier that it was often very confusing for people when they open up their Toronto directory and they would find multiple uses of the same street name. The directories could take a couple of years to implement council's renamings. These were typically done by bylaw. And so we see an example here where Bishop Street was changed in 1876. Act of Council became Claremont. This change was noted in 1877, but not implemented with the old name being noted and the first name and the new name being first used in 1878. Numberings and renumberings. You can see here on the left-hand side, Emily Street in 1856 had no street numbers. It had buildings on it occupied by these people. A decade later, numbering had been applied to Emily Street. But the wrinkle here is the people making the directories had changed their order. In 1856, they listed Emily Street's occupants from Wellington to King, and a decade later, from King to Wellington. So the question, of course, becomes, was number nine, a vacant house in 1866, the same property that James McIvy occupied in 1856? Only the assessment rolls at the city archives can clarify that. And we'll look at the assessment rolls in a later research session. Over on the right-hand session, we see the city's attempt to renumber as much of the city as possible, especially the main streets in the mid 1840s. And we can see how this works out for King Street. And it was at this time that Toronto started to talk about King Street East and King Street West, with Yonge Street being the great demarcator for the city at that time. Here was just a little test case looking at Brunswick Avenue. And again, repeatedly, the street is renumbered as properties are developed and new numbering approaches are adopted throughout the city. So again, always be sure if you're concerned that there may be a renumbering underway, see if there are the same people living or working at the same adjacent properties. And again, if necessary, check assessment rules or fines, fire insurance plans for confirmation whether or not a renumbering is underway. The directories use a whole variety of words and phrases to describe absence and what I call near presence. So the words empty, unoccupied, vacant, not built on, unfinished will pop up. Um, and here's just another caveat, a very rare case where three houses on Bloor Street West are unoccupied. They're actually awaiting demolition because I checked in later years and they had completely disappeared. And would these properties would be developed in later years. But again, this was one of those rare cases, unoccupied, not because they'd just been built, but because they were about to be unbuilt. Here you can take a look at the PDF at your leisure, and take a look at this research test case where once again I used the directory searching back in 5-year increments until I didn't find data, and then moving forward year after year until data was found to establish that the Midtown Bakery was first operated by the Krebs family in 1959. Classified business sections are very helpful. They're organized by category starting in 1856. And this was really pay for display, subscribers only until 1929. The directories claimed, starting in 1929 and running until 1967, that they included everyone in a given business category. And in 1968, this kind of comprehensive approach was replaced by a small ad focus guide, which would persist until the directories disappeared in 2001. Here, again, I want to underscore the importance that The classifieds before 1929 don't provide a comprehensive picture of a business category. And so my test case here from 1879, in the business directory, only 7 photographic artists are listed. But when I went through the alpha section, I found 42 photographers. So again, those listed in the business directory were those who paid to be included under the photographic artist classification. So here, again, just some wrinkles. Um, if you find businesses in all caps or in a bolded type, they've paid extra. Starting in 1883, you could create your own business category. And here's an example where actuaries, in this instance, just J.S. Crocker, paid to add a special category, not one that was already provided by the directory publisher. On the left-hand side, be aware that, well, if you're interested in food and drink in the city, that eating houses somehow overlap with restaurants, saloons, and taverns. And again, if you wanted to have booze, then probably you didn't go to an eating house. You went certainly either to a saloon or a tavern, but possibly also to a restaurant where you could get a bite to eat at the same time. The miscellaneous section is quite powerful. It's a real um, melange of information about the demography of the city, local, provincial, sometimes federal governments, as well as Toronto clubs, societies, schools, public and private, religious institutions, a whole grab bag of information. Um, and so the miscellaneous sections provided very rich detail up to 1930. Then more limited information was moved to the classified business section, and then finally simply disappears into the alpha section after 1967. This was just a test case involving Dr. Orrin Hayateka, a very powerful, influential Mohawk business leader. And I wanted to find out if he was and his organization was responsible for building the Foresters Hall on Brunswick Avenue. Well, it turns out that that hall was built by a rival organization, not the Independent Order of Foresters, but the Ancient Order of Foresters, a splinter organization. And I first unearthed this information through the miscellaneous section of the directory, and that led me to do secondary source research about these two organizations. Abbreviations and symbols. There's just a few used before the 1880s, and then afterwards they grow in number. And you'll need to be aware that abbreviations for the same subject can change over time. So I've here shown you an example on how the abbreviation of photographer changes. And you'll also find that over time, some abbreviations are the same, but for different subjects. So APPR can stand for apprentice, and then later on, it can stand for appraiser. Well, where do you find all this information? You'll find it typically in a list of abbreviations that is often found beside the beginning of the alpha section. Suburbs are abbreviated. Sometimes for a couple of decades, firms are abbreviated. And then symbols also become more well used over time. But to speed your research, I have created a little database of abbreviations and symbols that stretch from 1833 to 2001. And again, this PDF will be available on the Backlane Studios website. And you can see here all the abbreviations listed in order. And then at the end of the document, I tackle what the symbols mean at different times as well. Last minute changes are really important. Information was gathered. It appears right up to within a few weeks of publication. And sometimes it's described as an addenda or as a too late for inclusion section. It's really important if you, instead of using the a search tool like Control F or the search box on the Internet Archive editions, if you're searching manually or you're looking at physical copies, check the addenda because the person or business you may be interested in may have arrived late or moved late in the directory production process. Telephone numbers start to appear as of 1886. They become much more extensive starting in 1934 and 35. And then in 1988, a really interesting crisscross telephone section is added, where if you come across someone's little black book and you want to know what the phone numbers are linked to, you can use the numerical telephone guide to hopefully find that information. The directory publishers also produce maps to go along with the directories. This starts in 1866 with W.C. Chewett's directory, but it becomes much more commonplace with the directories produced by Polk and then by Mite. So really from the 1880s onward, you will find held by different institutions, the TPL, Library and Archives Canada, the City of Toronto Archives, the Archives of Ontario, these maps, which again are really a useful tool to be used in tandem with the city directories. So geographic scope. Toronto, uh, the Toronto directories would often include information about adjacent areas. So whether they were unincorporated communities or incorporated municipalities, they would often be described as suburbs. Um, but then all of the suburban information became part of the alpha and street sections starting in 1930. You'll also find on the TPL's website for Toronto directories that some adjacent municipalities, now part of the city of Toronto, produce their own directories. And this is the case for North Toronto and Long Branch, for example. Um, and then some separate suburban directories were produced for what we now call the city of Toronto in the 1950s and 60s. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Um, the TPL has developed a really useful guide to places. So if you're interested in Agincourt or New Toronto or Brockton, you can use this research tool to find out when information about those communities was included in the Toronto directory. I mentioned these suburban directories. They have, as of the time of making this video, have not been digitized, but you can find copies at the Toronto Reference Library. And you can see the pink areas and the blue areas are included in these suburban directories uh, as of 1958. Later in the mid 1960s, they're combined into something called the Greater Toronto Suburban Directory. And once again, if you're researching North York or Scarborough at this time, you'll want to take a look at the hard copies to see what information is available um, in the mid 1960s. One of the other wrinkles is that what we now call the outer boundary for the city of Toronto, it was completed with the annexation in 1974 of the West Rouge area. And you can find more information at your leisure when you take a look at the PDF. Um, and and again, when this data was incorporated into the City of Toronto directory. So Toronto was divided up after 1985-86. Instead of being all found in one single volume, it was divided into three volumes and then finally into five volumes. And to find your area of interest between 1988 and 1994, there's a useful street finder. I mentioned that earlier. And once again, you'll find this information at the beginning of each of the directory volumes. Starting in 1995, it becomes a bit more difficult as the directory split off into five volumes. If you're not quite clear about where the boundaries of the former city of Toronto, the former city of York, the former borough of East York are, then you'll want to use a map produced between 1966 and 1997 to show those pre-amalgamation boundaries. Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about accuracy and reliability. So some technical issues and then some inborn or data-related issues. By technical issues, these generally refer to failings of optical character recognition when you're using your digital search tools. So you may plug in a term and get no results. If this happens, simply scroll through the directory. It may take you a little bit longer, but again, don't always rely on what the optical characterization tools are producing when you do your online searches. Digitization may have failed. Left-hand side, you can see that there's an obvious scanning issue here. So again, if you're simply relying on the digital search tools, whatever information was contained on that page is not going to be returned as part of your search results. Much more troubling are the gutter losses. These start in the 1940s and seem to appear in almost every directory starting from 1985 and extending right through to 2001. So the way that the directories have been physically produced and then bound, the imaging has lost information down that center column. And once again, is a big source of unreliability. You will find pages that are missing, pages that are torn, pages that have been folded over. And so again, I just want to underscore, if you think that all of the information you're looking for is returned with a digital search, rather than a manual search, these are just a few examples. And again, the way to get around this, you can look at different copies that are available on microfilm at the City Archives or the Archives of Ontario. But again, these are the same copies that you will find physically at the Toronto Reference Library that were used for the digitalization program that was undertaken by the TPL. So once again, you need to look at other copies at other research institutions. Okay, let's take a look at the inborn issues. So these are the problems with data. There may be some issues with the occupational terms. So in 1859, you might think photographer means one thing, but there were many variant spellings or synonyms related to the notion of being a photographer at the time. So you could have been a daguerreotyper or a Daguerrean artist, an ambrotypist, a photographist. So you'll need to be aware if you're doing research around a certain business occupation, that you're covering off as many search terms as possible. I mentioned before the alpha section may call a line of business one thing, but the classified business section may call it something else. And so this is again the distinction between photographer versus photographic artist. Other data issues, misspellings. So Paul Kane, sometimes spelled with a C, sometimes spelled with a K. Nouns, terrazzo, sometimes spelled with two R's, which would be correct, and then incorrectly appearing with just one R. So once I learned that there were spelling errors, I had to go back and redo my data search using alternative search terms. Sometimes data would not be collected. People were away or people refused to provide information. So you can see this is reported, this failure is reported using different phrases like information unobtainable or not attainable or no return. So again, taking a look at the phrase no return, this is a two-page spread from 1968, and you can see how much data has not been collected. It's being acknowledged that that certain addresses didn't have information available for them. But again, it becomes more troublesome over time when you're trying to build a comprehensive picture of the city. Now, this may have begun in the 1980s, but certainly by the 1990s, the the publisher was no longer reporting on canvasser failure. And what I mean by this is that addresses that failed to report resident information were simply purged from the directory. And I know this because of my own family. So over on the left-hand side, you can see Reeves, Charles H. at 183 Calvin Drive. His good friends and next-door neighbors, the Braziers at 185 Calvington. But in 1999, neither the Reeves nor the Braziers provided data. And as a result, 183 Calvington and 185 Calvington are simply purged from the directory. So a missing address doesn't always mean that a building doesn't exist. It may mean that data has not been collected. And rather than admit this, they simply eliminated the address altogether. Data sometimes wasn't collected because of policy decisions. So typically you had to be 18 years or sometimes 20 years of age to appear in the directory. Gender could be an issue. Sometimes unmarried or unemployed women living at home were not included. Sometimes entire occupations like domestics were not included. Um, but it appears that everyone, or so it was claimed, 18 years and older or 20 years and older were collected after certain dates, and I've included them here. And where do you find some information about these policy decisions? There's often some note in the introduction to the sections you're looking at, or sometimes at the general introduction at the beginning of the directory itself. So be aware that if a name that you had previously found a directory is now missing, take a look to see if there's some other possible explanation as to why they may have disappeared later. Sometimes data was not collected because of language barriers, but we'll see that in starting in the 1880s, that some of these ethnic challenges would be acknowledged by the directory publisher. So people would be listed not by their name, but sometimes by their ethnic affiliation. And you can see here Macedonians started in 1906, Italians starting in 1910. So if you're interested in a certain ethnic group, be aware that you may search by common surnames affiliated with those ethnic groups, but also look for their English transliterations as well. And here we simply see an example. I was interested in this photograph. I went to the directory and I found, even though the photograph was made in November 1913, as of 1914, at 50 Trolley Street, foreigners were being listed. But I went elsewhere. I went to really important research report created by the New York Bureau of Municipal Research in 1913, a report on a physical survey of the city of Toronto. And it turned out that this house on Trolley Street was being occupied by Polish people. Ethno-racial categorization, this really applies to Black people across the course of the 19th century, sometimes referred to as colored with a U or no U, sometimes abbreviated as COL apostrophe D. Um, and it provides some interesting insight as we see on the right-hand side of people living on Emily Street and Emma Street, how racially mixed some of these streets in Toronto could be with a Black population and a non-Black population living side by side. Ethno-racial categorization can be kind of troubling. When you look on Wikipedia, and in fact, the city's official website, for some reason they focus on Sam Ching as the earliest record of someone from the Chinese community living in Toronto. But if you actually look at the directory in 1878, there are three people running what are called Chinese laundries at the time. And at the same time, we also know that this information doesn't just date from 1878. The directory was corrected to January 1st, 1878, which means all the data was collected in 1877. Let's turn for a few minutes to advertising. And so many of the advertisements are simply textual in nature. But I want to take a look at the visual side of the directories. And starting in 1846-47, over on the left-hand side, we see the first illustration appear in a Toronto City directory. And over time, these become more and more lavish. I love W.E. Cornell, a watchmaker, depicting not just what his business made, but the interior of his business, the exterior of his business by the year 1870. And so we learned something about heavy industry in the city. The ad for John McGee's Phoenix Foundry first appears in the 1856 directory. It's the first example of a non-black and white advertisement. So a little bit more of an eye-catching red is used. Lighter industries, of course, were common in the city. Here's one making superior horseradish on the left-hand side, and another advertising the new universal suspender, much better if you're in a sculling race. We find out something about lifestyle products and businesses. Here we're looking at hair products and hair designers. The directories for many, many years, well, long before the advent of the internet, used by police departments as well as private detective agencies as a way of finding people across North America. And they too, if you were running a detective agency, running some very eye-catching ads. This extended to the automotive trade. On the left-hand side, an ad for um, an early form of shock absorbers, but at the same time providing a great run of the profile of automobiles that were available in Toronto in 1923. The interiors of businesses were often presented in directory ads, and here are a couple from the 1880s and the early 1910s. Some of the more curious advertisements made their way into the directories. One for phrenologists in 1902. I was quite struck by D.M. Johnson Company from 1923, running a funeral home service and a real estate company out of the same address. Perhaps seen as a little bit of a conflict of interest, perhaps, but anyway, provided some rich information on how people made money in Toronto in the 1920s. Full color ads arrive in 1881 with the Toronto Lithographing Company. Um, the whole graphic arts and printing and bookbinding trade um, very commonly used eye-catching ads in both in black and white and color. And one of my favorites, this is a two-page spread from 1887. Try McKay Brothers for original and novel designs in printing. They were located at 57 King Street West. And what did the ad look on the other side of this page? And so the reason why the colors look a little bit different is that this page has actually been tipped in and bound with the other pages of the directory. That's what the following page looks like. Again, the graphic arts community provided a wide range of advertising approaches. These small inserts that you'll see on directory pages are called cards or ad cards. In 1905, the Commercial Art Company Limited made 15 different ad cards and had them run from one end of the directory to the other. Now, where can you find more information about some of these advertisements? Well, I've compiled a database of Toronto buildings that were illustrated in the Toronto City Directories from 1833 to 2001. Again, this is going to be available through the um, Backlane Studios website, and I provide some information about which businesses were illustrated, what their original address was, and what was the first year that the illustration appeared in the city directory. And this covers the gamut of buildings. I'm really interested in the more ordinary edifices that don't get a lot of note by architectural historians, but really make up much of the fabric of the city. And here are just a few examples of those types of buildings. Now, the more significant, the more voluminous buildings, of course, also are included. Um, some skyscrapers from 1928 and a presentation drawing from 1929 showing that what was always intended to be the first phase of Eaton's College Street. And then uh, um, uh, a little less visible in the illustration of what Eaton's intended the skyscraper complex to be. never implemented, but always envisioned. I mentioned that I note the first year that an illustration appears. Why is this important? For two reasons. First, you'll want to try and date as early as possible when an illustration was made. But when an illustration is used year after year after year, you can imagine that the building and the setting for the building has undergone change. And Nerlich and Company is a great example of this. This illustration first appears in 1908, and it is used year after year until 1926. So the same business appears repeatedly, but why I've included it at different times is because different illustrations are appearing. So here's a couple of halftone illustrations for Bell Brothers and Company, a brickmaker on Greenwood Avenue. And interestingly enough, may have been subject to a renumbering. The business didn't change location, but the numbering in the directory may have. One other example of different illustrations being tied to the same business, John T. Baldwin, a builder, a general contractor, showing off some of his recent construction activity across the city in the 1910s. So, one of the great questions that comes up repeatedly, well, what about before 1833 and what about after 2001? So, before directories existed and after they ceased publication. So, here's a link to a great research source that's been created by the Toronto Public Library listing York's inhabitants 1797 to 1823. After 2001, way more of a challenge. Um, I've dipped into the City of Toronto assessment rules, but all this provides me is with information about the property owners. Telephone directories, if you know someone's name, you may be able to find out where they lived if they were the telephone subscriber. So, for example, in the 1970s, when I still lived at home with my parents, if you look up Reeves, you'll find my father's name, Charles H., but you'll find no information about who else lived at Calvington, 183 Calvington Drive. And unfortunately, you won't find any information about where Charles H. Reeves worked. Um, but again, this is the challenge of working in the age of the internet.